Evgeny, as I said, last year we had Sherry Turkle, and she was warning about the way human behavior was becoming subordinate to technology. You take that critique much further, and I must admit it's something one doesn't hear very much in public discourse. You say that to critique technology today is almost like seeing or like being against enlightenment, against democratic values, social values, whereas actually to critique the internet is to critique a neoliberal regime. Can you explain that? Why do you say that it's a kind of neoliberal domain?
Sure. Well, what I think is happening is that you have a bunch of very, what's happening with my mic? Sure.
Can you hear
me? Yeah? Well, I hope so. Well, you see, I don't trust technology for a reason. So, I mean, what's happening is that essentially, I think a bunch of very powerful companies, most of which now are situated in Silicon Valley, are rapidly moving into very different fields, from health to education to surveillance to all sorts of insurance, big data, education, you name it. Essentially, you see an infusion of new players, all of which have very different business models, all of which are trying very hard to transform what we think about health, education, or surveillance, and how we think about it, and how we think about the common good. It's not actually a critique of technology. If you think about it very deeply, what I am arguing is that we have to be as critical and suspicious of many of these firms as we would be of large pharmaceutical companies or large energy companies or any of other industries that we tend to associate sometimes with promoting public good, but most often with actually undermining it. And what's happening is that while we do throw terms like big pharma or big food or big energy to criticize many of these companies, we never apply terms like big data to criticize companies in Silicon Valley, right? We think that big data is something nice, and it's not an industry, and I think we need to change that. We need to start seeing them as having an agenda. Very often that agenda would actually go against the common good, and we have to be critical and understand what are their motivations, what is in it for them.
So Evgeny, before we deepen that conversation, can you make it a little more apparent? Can you give examples? Because as I said, this is not something everyone's thinking or talking about. So what do you mean when you're saying that they're taking away the concept of common goods where health or education is concerned? Give me some examples.
Sure. I mean, okay, so think about the way in which now there is a lot of buzz and a lot of attention paid to what's known as massive open online courses, or MOOCs. In America, and increasingly, this is a very big theme abroad as well. What you're essentially seeing is a bunch of entrepreneurs who came on stage and said, well, what we can do is to provide new type of education which will deliver knowledge to virtually anyone who wants to get it, and we'll just go and draw on the resources of existing universities to develop those courses and then to make them available online for everyone to watch and access and whatnot. And of course, in theory and on paper, this sounds like a very noble and utopian vision. Wouldn't that be good if we can produce more courses that everyone can take? But of course, what is also happening is that it's changing profoundly the educational system, right? It's changing the ways in which faculty who are not superstars and who cannot produce a superstar course that will go viral online will eventually see their jobs transformed from being tenured academics into being adjuncts and eventually into being teaching assistants, as all the teaching and ranking and rating is done by the students themselves, right? The students grading each other, right? And that's already transforming how you think about teaching and instruction, but it's also turning education into this huge Taylorist machine, right? And has lots of structural consequences. But my bigger point here is that what you see here is what I would call the appification, from the word app, of public problems. What we're essentially doing is replacing an infrastructure that we thought could deliver free, accessible, high-quality education to everyone who could get it, with an idea that it's all up to you, it's all up to your personal responsibility to go online, register for the right courses, do the right thing, perpetual learning, growing your resume. I mean, all of those are very different ideas from the idea of, going and spending 4 years in a university and attending lectures and, being taught by faculty who have full-time jobs, and because of the fact that they have full-time jobs, can actually afford to participate in public debate and take controversial positions, right? As you replace that system with the MOOC system, with the idea of education delivered through an app, or health delivered through an app, right? Which is also a very big theme in Silicon Valley. The idea being that now we can actually dismantle the public health system and just delegate everything to the patient. So now you start monitoring yourself because you have a smartphone that has all sorts of sensors in it, and it allows you to monitor how much you exercise, it allows you to monitor how well you sleep, it allows you to monitor what kind of food you eat, and all of that would eventually, this is the emancipatory logic and rhetoric of Silicon Valley, will allow you to better control your health. But of course, this also results in people feeling more and more anxious and eventually buying more and more drugs, and eventually, helping the big pharma industry to keep growing.
Yeah, so Evgeny, I mean, if I were to sum it up, your anxiety is that we are being transformed from self-critical, self-thinking citizens into pretty much being designed consumers of something that someone else is designing. Is that a fair summation?
Well, that's possible summary of what I'm saying, one of the summaries. But I mean, look, the bigger, I think, concern is that there are profound intellectual, political, and economic changes that are underlying this transformation. It's not just about innovation. It's not just about technology. It's not just about more information and knowledge. The amplification of public problems, right, has other consequences, and all of those consequences will affect how we think about how we relate to each other. I mean, if you get all of your healthcare delivered to you via app, you have no stake in essentially, the idea of public health as a whole. The whole idea of public health gets dismantled, right? And what I'm trying to say is that now that essentially all becomes around information. It's all about delivery of information, monitoring of information, and nudging citizens based on monitoring what it is they're doing. Silicon Valley becomes crucial to virtually every industry, right? And they are entering every industry from transportation with self-driving cars and all sorts of services you can book outside of the existing taxi system. For example, in America, services like Uber, services like Airbnb, which allow you to book a room when you go and stay in New York or Washington outside of the existing hotel system, which for many people sounds great because it gets cheaper, but it also means that a lot of these new participants are not paying any taxes because they are being seen as just amateurs and entrepreneurs and not part of the professional industry. And then you end up with stories like the one that just ran in an American magazine called Fast Company of a guy who deliberately ran 6 apartments to then list them back on Airbnb and thus claim that he's part of what Silicon Valley calls sharing economy, thus not paying any taxes, while in fact he's making lots of money that would otherwise need to be taxed if he operated like a hotel, right? And what we need to do is to make it harder for people to rely on these buzzwords, to rely on this rhetoric of innovation, sharing economy, perpetual creative destruction. All of these terms Silicon Valley has kind of appropriated, and we need to see them for what they are, and they are political and economic projects with the political consequences.
Yeah, so Evgeny, I mean, before we move away from this, you've been talking about the rise of the psychological state. Can you explain that further? And also, again, to understand more, you are worrying about the fact that the sheer messy dialogue that makes us human beings, self-reflective human beings, is being eroded by Silicon Valley designers who are pretty much designing us So can you explain?
Sure.
what
I mean,
is-
look, I think you have to understand the appeal of information in Silicon Valley in the broader intellectual context of how our own thinking about governance and administration has changed. And I think it has changed in such a way that the technocrats and the consultants have more or less taken over, and that the politician as a species is sort of dead. Right? Now it's all about administration, it's all about governance, it's all about optimizing things. And how do you optimize things? Well, you optimize things armed with data information, and this is why I think we are seeing the emergence essentially of a new mode of governance where the technocrats rely on Silicon Valley to monitor what's happening. And it's not just about surveillance, it can also be about tax avoidance, it can also be about health, it can also be about many other things. I mean, if you, again, carry a cell phone, a smartphone in your pocket, and that smartphone has a sensor that can monitor how much you walk, which is the case, by the way, with Android phones. So Google has built a special app called Google Now, which monitors how much you walk on a monthly basis, and at the end of each month, without you ever asking for it, it tells you that this month you've walked 20% less than the previous months. Right? This is the kind of change that a lot of policymakers and technocrats find very appealing because they know that they can tap into this new infrastructure, both to monitor what citizens are doing and to steer them towards what they think is the right thing to do. Right? So essentially what is happening is that you have this new generation of technocrats who are all fascinated with topics like behavioral economics, who think that all of the problems that we have in the world are essentially the product of irrational behavior by individuals. It's a very right-wing neoliberal approach to problem solving, right? They don't see that some of the problems are just structural consequences of poverty or of corporations having too much power. It's all about you making a stupid decision when presented with the choice of whether to eat more vegetables or meat, or whether to exercise more, whether to walk more, if you think about it in the context of health. So think about how this new psychological state, armed with this new technological infrastructure, is tackling a problem like obesity, which is a big problem in America. So the way in which they are tackling it is not by going after sort of big food, or going after powerful food companies, or regulating how they advertise junk food to children, or building more infrastructure where people can actually exercise or walk more, or making sure that farmers markets are better accessible by public transport. All of the solutions are off the table. Now it's all about the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit is, well, push more information towards the citizen and tell the citizen that it's all their own fault. Right? So if they're not exercising enough, we'll tell them to exercise more and tell them to eat more vegetables, even if they can't afford it or don't have the time to go and buy it or don't have a car to drive to the farmer's market. Right? And so this sort of substitution of tackling causes of problems, as opposed to just trying to tinker with the symptoms and just by trying to essentially patch what looks bad. To me, this is the fundamental change. And you can see it, again, we just had this fascinating session about, before us, about Taliban in America. Think about how America now tackles a problem like terrorism. Right? So again, armed with big data, armed with predictive algorithms, armed with this fascinating software products which can allow them to predict who presents most trouble to America, what they do is that they just go and try to sort out those people based on risk, and then they take measures, right, based on their assessment of how troublesome some people are, given what America is out there doing with its foreign policy. No one is actually eager to ask deep, tough questions about why some people become terrorists and some people don't become terrorists, right? So no one wants to have a debate about how the use of drones in Yemen might be contributing to the radicalization of Yemeni youth. Why have that debate if you can just identify the most problematic Yemeni youth by monitoring their cell phones or by monitoring their online communications, right? So essentially you don't have to ask any questions about US foreign policy in the Middle East or Saudi Arabia or the use of drones. All of those questions can stay in the background. You can keep the system as it is and focus all of your technological, informational, and processing resources on identifying the threats to the system. And then you deal with the stress to the system, and you don't even talk about the structural causes of things. And this is what I mean by this elimination of deliberative component to our democracy. Essentially, we no longer want to talk about those problems, and the politicians don't want to talk about them either. They elected for 5 years. Their job is to not mess it up, right? Though they think like consultants, and they have no interest in thinking about the longer public good outside of their office term. This is what I mean when I say that the politicians as a species are sort of dead, right? So what happens after 5 years is not their department. That's why, if they have big data to identify all of those suspicious people, they'll go and identify them, and they'll make sure that they neutralize them. But that, of course, wouldn't eliminate the terrorist threat, because the terrorist threat is the product of ideological and structural causes, and not just the product of America not having a perfect system for identifying most suspicious people.
Evgeny, when you speak of surveillance and, as you said, taking out problematic young youth, it becomes much more evident. But when you speak about the kind of self-help tools regarding education and health,
Sure.
I guess for many people it'll be a more complicated argument. I understand the point you're making about the fact that one is not discussing the structures out of which problems arise, access to education and the mess of it, which is important. But all the march of human history has been about finding solutions that seem a rung up from before.
Sure.
So isn't there kind of inevitability to this? There is inefficiency. For instance, in India, where we actually need like 2.5 million new teachers, and we don't have that. Yes, it'll take very, very long to get there. We need education now.
Sure.
We've made a technological leap. The phone is in everyone's hands.
Sure.
It does seem a very tempting solution to put online courses into young children's hands. So how would you argue against that?
Sure, but again, I think we have to start separating sort of a broader debate about technology as a useful contributor to progress. And that argument, I have no beef with. I'm all for using, I have probably 3 Kindles and 2 tablets. I'm all for using these devices to access knowledge, access information, and study it, and that's a wonderful thing. What you have to understand is that, Silicon Valley is not going to solve India's problems. It has zero interest in it. I'm sorry if it sounds shocking, but they're not going to solve those problems, right? It might be a byproduct of whatever it is they want to do, and in which case we should all be happy if that happens, right? But I think that the odds of that happening are very unlikely. What I'm interested in is figuring out why the introduction of apps and why the appearance of MOOCs, that allow us to track our own well-being and health, why is it counted under progress while essentially it's undermining the previous achievements of social democracy, whether it's public education or public health or public transportation in the case of self-driving cars and whatnot, right? Those were also achievements, and I'm just not sure that the progress we're being sold is actually progress, right? And it might be that in the long term, we would be better off thinking about more robust institutional and structural responses to the problems of education than just delegating everything to a private company like Google, which again pretends that it's not actually on par with ExxonMobil or Halliburton, and that it's more on par with Transparency International or Human Rights Watch, right? It pretends that it has this humanitarian dimension to it, and we're supposed to believe it. And I just think that this is ridiculous. This is not going to end well. And this is why I think we need to be much more critical about their rhetoric and about their intent and about what it is that they're actually doing. To say that we should let Google to pursue its mission, which is to organize all of the world's knowledge and make it universally accessible and useful, to me it sounds as meaningful as to say that we should let ExxonMobil organize all of the world's oil and make it universally, useful. I just don't think why. I just don't know why the privatization of public resources now counts as an unambiguously good thing. And essentially what we are doing with Google and Silicon Valley as privatizing knowledge infrastructure, which can be run on a very different logic. And if it's run on a very different logic, it might not actually open all the doors to surveillance and monitoring that are currently open. I mean, just think about how Gmail, Google's email system works. Right? You all know that you get it for free, and it scans your email, you get an ad, and we all kind of accepted this logic as normal. Imagine if 10 years ago I would come to you and I would say, well, you know, the postal office, forget about the current model. Who needs stamps? Stamps are just a thing of the past. Imagine if you could send all of your letters for free, but to make that happen, I would need to open every letter at the postal office, scan it, insert a relevant ad, then seal it back and set it to the next recipient, whoever it was addressed to. I mean, you think this is crazy, but that's exactly the model we have accepted with our email. That's exactly how our email works. And my fear is that this is the model where you get everything for free and you pay for it with your data that will eventually appear in every single field of life. You will have, and that's already happening in California and Silicon Valley, you will have day-to-day appliances and gadgets that you essentially get for free, and you pay for them with the data that you generate in the context of their use. So you get your toothbrush for free, but since it's a smart toothbrush that has a sensor and internet connectivity that connects to your insurance company and to your dentist, you essentially don't have to pay for it, but the data is being transmitted and somebody is making money off of it, and you might think that, well, why should I care?
And suddenly you'll find your teeth insurance costs more because they know you have bad teeth.
Well, I mean, it might be that your insurance will actually cost less because your teeth are in order and you're eating well. And, you know, this is why a lot of people are buying into this. They think that, well, there is nothing for me to lose. And as long as I can get a discount, why shouldn't I do it? It does work really well with sensors you can install in your car, for example, in America now, to pay less for your car insurance. If you can prove that you're a safer driver, why not do it? I mean, the problem with this logic is that it only works well for half of the population who are better than the average, right? People who are worse than the average will have to pay more than they are currently paying, and you will eventually end up in a situation where, of course, we would be told that you all have a choice. You don't have to use a smart toothbrush. You don't need to have a sensor installed in your car to monitor your driving habits. And I think that logic is just spurious. It never works this way. It never worked that way with Facebook. It never worked that way with mobile phones. 5 years ago, we were all told you don't have to be on Facebook. You don't need to have a mobile phone. I mean, if you live in America right now, if you don't have a cell phone and you are not on Facebook, NSA assumes that you're probably a terrorist or you're hiding a terrorist in your basement, right? I mean, like, this is no longer optional. And my fear is that in 5 years, you'll be facing the same situation as sensors proliferate into every single artifact, right? If you refuse to have a sensor in your car to monitor whether you're driving safely or not, it means you have something to hide. And if you have something to hide, well, why not pay more, right? And this is like what's so puzzling, that again, we're being sold all of these devices as very emancipatory, as devices that will eventually allow us to save more. And, you know, personally and individually, many of us would indeed gain, right? But there is a moral component here, and it's that a lot of people will lose, and we don't have a safety net, right? And this is where you see that the problem is public. It's not private. You cannot reduce it just to consumer level, which is what Silicon Valley wants to do. And this is where all the models of the social democracy and the public good were actually more helpful, because they actually forced us to acknowledge that we live amongst other people who also have interests, and perhaps in our pursuit of consumerist nirvana, we should actually acknowledge that their interests might get hurt and have to think politically and morally and ethically, which is not at all in the interest of Silicon Valley.
So, Evgeny, I mean, you know, just to push this idea further, but tomorrow we're going to have William Murico talking about how algorithms is pretty much removing free choice from our lives. And you're speaking also about how algorithms, technological designs are constructing us in certain ways against even our own knowledge or our conscious knowledge. Mm-hmm. Do you think soon there will be a time where we might need almost like a court of law, a kind of Supreme Court, where algorithms need to be presented to be passed whether those algorithms should be allowed into public life or not? You know, do you envision a future like that?
I have written about it, and I've made a proposal that we need some kind of auditing system like we have with financial statements, where, you know, the main argument that companies like Google would tell you why they don't want to publish the algorithms. They would tell you that if we start making them public, then people will start taking advantage of it. So spammers, advertisers, they'll just trick us, right? Okay, I accept that argument. But it doesn't mean that you can't have proper public supervision over what's happening. And to do that, you need to have an independent third party who can step in and verify that the algorithms that are being used do not have strong racial or socioeconomic biases. And it's a huge problem, especially as a lot of the activities that we are currently conducting in analog mode are becoming digital. So there is a huge wave of interest now towards what's known as predictive policing. And it's basically predictive policing. And
Policing.
Policing, yeah, like police. So, and it's basically the use of historical data and big data and software and algorithms in order to predict where future crimes might happen. So you're basically feeding the system with a lot of the past statistics about crime, and the system tells you where you have to send your police force in order to basically make sure that the crime rate drops and crimes are not committed. Right? So there is some kind of probabilistic value in those predictions, and actually a lot of police departments in America are switching to this model. They actually love it. Whether those algorithms do incorporate certain biases, whether they would send you to more zones than to others, whether the data that you feed into them already incorporates certain biases, those are very big questions, which of course we are not tackling yet because all of those algorithms are being pushed by private companies with their own agendas, right? But again, I don't think that the fear here is that of the algorithm. The algorithm can do many different things depending on how it's designed. How it's designed is deeply influenced by the political and economic system in which its manufacturer finds themselves, right? But for me, the sort of a dark example that I would like to leave you with about how this algorithmic future might impoverish our decision making is, imagine a situation where you go to Google or Facebook and you search for something very basic. You search for, I want to become a vegetarian. How do you become a vegetarian, right? You go to Google or Facebook, graph search. On Facebook, you can actually search for all of the restaurants of your friends, right? The ones that they like. And imagine that you conduct one of those searches. And since all of those companies rely essentially on advertising, and they have various agreements with other third-party companies as to who gets your data, imagine that as a result of your search, your local supermarket and your local steakhouse finds out that there is a person with this particular mobile phone, they might not know your name, but they might know your devices and that you are carrying them, is interested in becoming a vegetarian. So when you go to a supermarket, you suddenly get a message from a supermarket telling you that, well, today, only once a year, you get a special discount from our supermarket, 20% off on all meat products. You think, well, great, why not go buy some meat? So you go and buy some meat. The following day, you walk by your steakhouse, and you get similar message saying that, well, only tonight you get 50% off on your steak dinner. And, and this goes on for 3 months, and eventually you figure out, well, why should I become a vegetarian when, life is so good and meat is so cheap, right? And, of course, you think that that decision was completely yours and it was completely autonomous and you've made it having deliberated for 3 months over this wonderful, dilemma, only to find out that, it was very structured in such a way that you had no choice but to accept, right? And this is what bothers me a lot. I mean, I've coined a term which I call invisible barbed wire. And I think that this is what's happening. Barbed wire, and I think that this is what's happening. Essentially, we are getting this false idea that a lot of the decisions that we do make are fully ours and fully autonomous, while in fact they aren't, and they are shaped by big companies with big interests and with things to lose. It doesn't matter that I became a vegetarian or not. It could be, the world's tofu industry sending me the exact opposite message, right? It's not that you have to blame one particular player. It's just that the kind of manipulation that becomes possible and the way in which it is invisible is profoundly disturbing and profoundly, and you know, I was talking about food. You can apply the same model to politics and to elections and to micro-targeting, right? It's not just at the level of consumer choices, it's also the level of ideas that we have to start worrying about those things.
Evgeny, before we go away, there's, you know, as I said, this is perhaps the most trenchant criticism of the use of technology rather than technology itself. But you have a weak chink in your armor. You know, I was reading that when you want to be cut off from technology, you're not able to use your own mental strength, but that you lock your iPad and all your gadgets inside a safe,
sure.
And then you have a mechanism by which you lock the key into that safe as well, and then there's a timer where even if you want to access your gadgets before that, it doesn't allow you to do it. So how do you explain that now?
Well, again, I don't know where you were reading that. I never said that I don't have the mental strength to do it. What I was saying is that if I can have a piece of technology that will spare me the anxiety that this neoliberal regime has created around me, I'll gladly use the technology. So in this case, instead of having this decision-making process every 5 minutes, whether I should go and check what's new on Twitter, whether I should go and check whether I have received another email, why not just rely on technology to solve the problem of technology? So in my case, I have a safe as a timer, and I do lock my iPhone, and I do lock my internet cable in it when I work, and hey, I get a book done every 18 months.
Hey, but Evgeny, that is a bit of a cop-out because, as you said, you want to be spared the anxiety of decision-making. What if someone's fat and they want to be spared the anxiety of walking 20 miles without somebody telling them how much they're achieving?
How did we come up to a point in our lives where we think that anxiety is a good thing? No, I don't want to have anxiety in my life, and if I can get rid of the anxieties through a technological innovation, I'm all up for it. Again, many people misunderstand my position when they think that my beef is with technology. My beef is the political and economic and social system behind it. And in this case, believe me, I spent a good few years thinking about the moral implications of having a safe as a timer, filming my connectivity. I'm yet to find a persuasive reason why I'm sort of violating any of the moral or ethical precepts.
Well, thank you, Evgeny. Thank you for that warning. And thanks to you, next time I check my Gmail, I'm going to remember the postman with nostalgia. Thank you for being here.